In a world where technology rules everything from morning coffee to military defense systems, one young woman's rejection of modern convenience would either save thousands of lives or doom an entire military base. Sarah Chen had spent her 23 years living off the grid on her grandmother's farm, trusting only in her hands, her instincts, and the ancient wisdom passed down through generations. When cyber attacks began crippling global infrastructure, the military came knocking on her door, desperate for someone who could operate without a single digital device. What they didn't expect was that this simple farm girl would expose the greatest weakness in their billion-dollar defense system, and that her old-fashioned ways would be the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. Sarah Chen wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished milking Bessie, the old Holstein cow who had been her companion for the past 5 years. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. This was her favorite time of day, when the world was quiet except for the gentle sounds of farm life. Chickens clucking in their coop, the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture, and the whisper of wind through the cornfields. She had inherited this 100-acre farm from her grandmother 3 years ago, and unlike the neighboring properties that had been modernized with automated feeding systems, GPS-guided tractors, and computerized monitoring equipment, Sarah's farm operated exactly as it had 50 years ago. She used her hands to plant, tend, and harvest. She read the weather by watching cloud patterns and feeling the wind. She knew when her animals were sick by observing their behavior, not by checking digital sensors. The other farmers in the county thought she was stubborn, maybe even foolish. You could triple your yield with modern equipment, they would tell her at the monthly farmers market. Why make life so hard for yourself? But Sarah had learned from her grandmother that there was wisdom in the old ways, a connection to the land that machines could never replicate. Her grandmother, Mei Chen, had immigrated from rural China in the 1960s, bringing with her generations of farming knowledge that didn't require electricity or computers. She had taught Sarah to read the soil by feeling its texture between her fingers, to predict rain by the way animals behaved, and to preserve food using methods that had sustained families for centuries. Sarah lived in the old farmhouse, without internet, without a smartphone, and without any of the smart devices that had become essential to modern life. She had a landline telephone for emergencies, a radio for weather updates, and a small television that she watched maybe once a week. Her neighbors thought this lifestyle was impossible in 24, but Sarah thrived in it. On this particular morning, as she carried the milk pail back to the house, she noticed something unusual. The radio she had left playing in the barn had gone silent. She walked over and fiddled with the dial, but got only static. That was strange. The local station always played music during the early morning hours. Inside the house, she tried turning on her small television, but the screen remained black. Even more puzzling, when she picked up her landline phone to call her neighbor Jim Morrison, there was no dial tone. The phone line was completely dead. Sarah wasn't immediately concerned. Equipment failed sometimes, and she had learned to be self-reliant. She went about her morning routine, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, and checking on her vegetable garden. The tomatoes were coming in beautifully, and she made a mental note to start canning them soon. It was around 9 in the morning when she first heard the helicopters. Living in rural Montana, military aircraft weren't completely unusual. There was a training base about 50 miles north, but these helicopters sounded different, more urgent, and they seemed to be flying in a pattern that kept bringing them back over her area. By noon, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Usually, she could see the contrails of commercial aircraft crossing the sky throughout the day. Today, the sky was completely clear except for those military helicopters. No passenger planes, no cargo aircraft, nothing. She was repairing a fence post when the convoy arrived. 3 black SUVs and a military truck came down her dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust. Sarah had never seen so many vehicles on her property at once. She set down her hammer and walked toward the house, curious but not alarmed. The vehicles stopped in her front yard, and men in both military uniforms and civilian suits got out. The man who approached her first was tall, with graying hair and a bearing that spoke of authority. His uniform showed the rank of colonel. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel James Harrison, United States Army Cyber Command. I need to speak with you about a matter of national security." Sarah looked at the serious faces surrounding her. "I'm not sure how I can help you with anything related to national security, Colonel. I'm just a farmer." "That's exactly why we need your help," Colonel Harrison replied. "May we come inside?" Sarah gestured toward her front porch. "We can talk out here." "What's this about?" Colonel Harrison looked around at her property. The old barn, the hand-pumped well, the clothes hanging on a line to dry. "Ms.
Chen, Are you aware that the country is currently under a massive cyber attack?
No, I wasn't aware of that. My phone and radio aren't working, but I figured it was just equipment trouble.
It's not equipment trouble. Starting at approximately 6 a.m. Eastern Time, our nation's critical infrastructure began experiencing coordinated cyber attacks. Power grids, communication networks, transportation systems, financial networks, everything connected to the internet is being systematically compromised. Sarah absorbed this information. That sounds serious, but I still don't understand how I can help. One of the civilian men stepped forward. He was younger, maybe in his 30s, with the intense look of someone who hadn't slept in days. Chen, our intelligence indicates that you operate your farm completely independent of modern digital systems. No internet, no smart devices, no computerized equipment. Is that correct? Yes, that's right. I prefer the old ways. Colonel Harrison exchanged a glance with the younger man. Miss Chen, we need someone who can function completely outside of digital networks. Our military bases, our command centers, even our backup systems, they're all vulnerable because they're all connected in some way to networks that can be hacked. The attack is more sophisticated than anything we've ever seen, the younger man continued. They're not just shutting down systems, they're turning them against us. Military drones are being redirected, communication systems are spreading false orders, even our defense systems are being compromised. Sarah sat down on her porch steps, trying to process what she was hearing. You want my help because I don't use technology? We need your help because you're one of the few people in the country who can still function normally, Colonel Harrison said. Our base is 40 miles from here and we're operating on emergency protocols. But we need someone who can move freely, observe, and communicate without being detected by digital surveillance. What kind of help are you talking about? The younger man pulled out a paper map, an actual physical map, not a digital device. There are other installations that have gone dark. We need someone to physically check on them, to report back on their status. Someone who won't show up on any digital tracking, who can't be traced through phone records or GPS. Sarah looked at the map, then at the serious faces around her. You want me to be a spy? More like a scout, Colonel Harrison said. Someone who can gather information the old-fashioned way. We have reason to believe that some of our installations weren't just knocked offline. They may have been completely compromised. We need eyes on the ground, someone who can tell us what's really happening. Why should I trust you? How do I know you're really who you say you are? It was a fair question. In a world where digital verification was impossible, how could anyone prove their identity? Colonel Harrison reached into his pocket and pulled out his military ID, then handed her a letter with official letterhead. This is all we have without digital verification. But Miss Chen, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Our country is under attack in a way we never anticipated. Our technological superiority has become our greatest weakness. We need people who remember how to operate without it. Sarah studied the documents, though she realized they could be forgeries. But something about the colonel's manner convinced her he was telling the truth. The presence of military helicopters, the convoy of vehicles, the obvious tension in all these men. This wasn't an elaborate deception. What exactly would you want me to do? There's a communications relay station about 30 miles east of here. Colonel Harrison pointed to a spot on the map. It went offline 6 hours ago. We need someone to physically check on it and report back on its status. No radio communication, no digital devices, just old-fashioned observation and reporting. How would I report back without radio? The younger man smiled for the first time. The same way messages were sent for thousands of years. You'd return here and tell us what you saw. Sarah looked out over her fields, thinking about her quiet life and her carefully maintained independence from the modern world. Now that same independence was being called upon to serve her country in its hour of need. There's something else, Colonel Harrison added. The attacks appear to be escalating. What started as infrastructure disruption is becoming something more serious. We've lost contact with several military installations. We don't know if they've been compromised, captured, or worse. What makes you think I'm qualified for this kind of mission? Miss Elizabeth. Chen, you've been living off the grid by choice. You know how to navigate without GPS, communicate without cell phones, and survive without modern conveniences. Right now, those are the most valuable skills in America. Sarah thought about her grandmother, who had lived through wars and hardships with nothing but her wits and determination. Mei Chen had always taught her that skills and knowledge were more valuable than any technology, because machines could break or be turned against you, but human wisdom endured. If I agree to help, what guarantees do I have that you'll leave my farm alone afterward? I don't want to become part of your military system. You have my word that your independence will be respected, Colonel Harrison said. We're not trying to recruit you permanently. We just need your help during this crisis. Sarah stood up and walked to the edge of her porch, looking out over the land her grandmother had worked for decades. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, and she could hear her chickens chattering in their coop. This simple, peaceful life had always been enough for her, but now it seemed that her choice to live simply might be exactly what her country needed. I'll need to take care of my animals first, she said finally. And I'll need to know exactly what you want me to look for at this relay station. Colonel Harrison's relief was visible. We can help with your animals. As for the mission, we need to know if the facility is still in our control, if the personnel are safe, and if the equipment has been damaged or compromised. How will I know if it's been compromised? The younger man stepped forward again. Any signs of foreign presence, any equipment that looks like it's being tampered with, any personnel acting strangely? Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Sarah nodded slowly. Her grandmother had always told her to trust her instincts, that human intuition was sharper than any machine sensor. When would you need me to go? As soon as possible. Every hour we go without information puts more lives at risk. Give me 2 hours to secure my farm and prepare. I'll need supplies for the journey. We can provide anything you need. No, Sarah said firmly. I'll use my own supplies, my own methods. That's the whole point, isn't it? To operate completely outside your systems? Colonel Harrison smiled, and for the first time he looked hopeful. Yes, Ms. Chen, that's exactly the point. As the military convoy prepared to return to their base, Sarah walked through her farm, checking on everything one more time. She fed the animals extra portions, secured the chicken coop, and made sure all the gates were properly closed. She packed a simple backpack with water, dried food, a first aid kit, and a few basic tools. Looking at herself in the mirror before leaving, she saw just what she'd always been, a simple farm girl in work clothes and boots. But now she was also something else. Possibly the most valuable asset the United States military had in their fight against an invisible enemy. As she prepared to leave her safe, quiet world behind, Sarah couldn't help but think that her grandmother would have understood this moment perfectly. Mei Chen had always said that true strength came not from machines or technology, but from the human spirit's ability to adapt and endure. The helicopters were still circling overhead as Sarah locked her farmhouse door and prepared to step into a world where her old-fashioned skills would be put to the ultimate test. Sarah mounted her horse, Thunder, a sturdy quarter horse she had raised from a foal. Unlike the military vehicles that could be tracked by satellite or disabled by cyber attacks, Thunder ran on hay and determination. She had chosen to ride rather than drive her old pickup truck, reasoning that a horse would be quieter and less likely to draw attention. The relay station was 30 miles east through a combination of back roads and wilderness trails. Sarah had plotted her route using an old paper map, avoiding main highways where military or enemy activity might be concentrated. She estimated it would take her about 4 hours to reach the facility, moving carefully through terrain she knew well from years of exploring. The first few miles took her through familiar farmland, past properties belonging to neighbors she had known all her life. But something was different today. The Morrison farm, which usually bustled with activity, was completely quiet. No tractors in the fields, no workers visible anywhere. Even more unsettling, she could see Jim Morrison's prized smart tractor sitting motionless in the middle of a half-harvested cornfield, as if it had simply stopped working mid-task. At the Henderson place, the situation was even more disturbing. The automated milking system had apparently malfunctioned, and she could hear the distressed lowing of cattle that needed milking. The family's electric gates stood open, and their smart home security system was flashing error lights. Sarah made a mental note to check on the Hendersons on her return journey. As she rode deeper into the wilderness, following old logging trails her grandmother had shown her years ago, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just an attack on military systems. It was an assault on the entire technological infrastructure that modern life depended on. Thunder picked his way carefully down a rocky slope, his sure footing a reminder of why horses had been humanity's partners for thousands of years before machines took over transportation. Sarah found herself grateful for every lesson her grandmother had taught her about reading the land, following natural landmarks, and trusting in tried-and-true methods. About 2 hours into her journey, she heard the sound of engines in the distance. Sarah guided Thunder into a grove of trees and dismounted, holding his bridle to keep him quiet. Through the branches, she watched a convoy of unmarked black vehicles speed past on the road below. These weren't the same vehicles that had visited her farm. The military convoy had been clearly marked with official insignia. These vehicles had no identification at all. The sight made her uneasy. Who else would be moving through this area during a national emergency? Sarah waited until the sound of engines faded completely before continuing her journey. The terrain became more challenging as she approached the location of the relay station. According to her map, it should be situated on a hilltop about 5 miles ahead, surrounded by a security fence and accessible only by a single access road. Sarah decided to approach from the backside, using the cover of forest to get close enough to observe without being seen. She dismounted and tied Thunder securely to a tree in a small clearing about a quarter mile from the facility. The horse had water and grass, and Sarah whispered reassuring words to him before beginning her approach on foot. She moved carefully through the undergrowth, using skills she had learned during childhood games of hide-and-seek in these same woods. As she crept closer to the relay station, the first thing Sarah noticed was the silence. There should have been the hum of generators, the sound of cooling fans, the general background noise of an active electronic facility. Instead, she heard nothing but wind through the trees and the distant call of a hawk. Peering through the tree line, Sarah got her first clear view of the relay station. The facility consisted of several buildings surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Large satellite dishes and communication towers rose from the complex, but none of them appeared to be moving or operating. Even from a distance, she could see that several windows had been broken and the main gate stood open. More alarming was what she saw parked inside the compound. 3 of the same type of unmarked black vehicles she had observed earlier sat near the main building. Armed men in civilian clothing were stationed around the perimeter, and they definitely weren't American military personnel. Sarah's heart began beating faster as she realized what she was looking at. The relay station hadn't just gone offline. It had been captured. But by whom? The men weren't wearing uniforms or displaying any national insignia, but their movements and positioning suggested military training. She needed to get closer to gather more specific information for Colonel Harrison. Moving with painstaking care, Sarah worked her way around the perimeter of the facility, staying well within the tree line. Her grandmother had taught her to move through forests without disturbing the natural environment, a skill that now proved invaluable. From a position behind the main building, Sarah could see into one of the windows. Inside, she observed men working at computer terminals that appeared to be functioning normally. The facility's power was clearly operational, which meant the equipment blackout was intentional rather than the result of damage. As she watched, one of the men inside spoke into a radio device. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she could see him pointing to various pieces of equipment and gesturing emphatically. Whatever they were doing, it was organized and purposeful. Moving to another vantage point, Sarah discovered something even more troubling. Behind the main building, she could see what appeared to be American military personnel sitting on the ground with their hands secured behind their backs. At least 6 men and women in U.S. Army uniforms were being held as prisoners. The scope of the situation was becoming clear. This wasn't just a cyber attack, it was a physical invasion. Someone had taken control of American infrastructure facilities and was holding military personnel as captives. The question was, who were these attackers, and how many other facilities had been compromised? Sarah needed to gather as much information as possible while remaining undetected. She spent the next hour carefully observing the facility from multiple angles, counting personnel, noting equipment, and documenting everything she could see. The attackers appeared to have about 12 people on site, armed with what looked like military-grade weapons. They had established a professional perimeter defense and were operating with clear discipline and organization. From conversations she could partially overhear, Sarah determined that the attackers were speaking English, but with accents she couldn't quite identify. They weren't obviously foreign, but something about their speech patterns seemed different from local residents. As afternoon shadows grew longer, Sarah realized she had learned as much as she could without risking detection. She needed to return to her farm and report her findings to Colonel Harrison. But as she began to withdraw from her observation position, she heard something that made her freeze. One of the guards was walking directly toward her hiding spot, apparently making a routine patrol of the perimeter. Sarah pressed herself against the ground behind a fallen log, hardly daring to breathe as boots passed within 10 feet of her position. The guard paused, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought she had been discovered. But after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps continued past her position. Sarah waited until she was sure the guard had moved on before beginning her careful retreat through the forest. Every step felt dangerous. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot in the quiet woods. When she finally reached the clearing where Thunder waited, Sarah felt overwhelming relief. The horse nickered softly in greeting, and she quickly untied his reins and mounted up. But instead of heading directly back to her farm, Sarah decided to take a detour that would allow her to check on one more location. According to Colonel Harrison's map, there was a smaller communications facility about 10 miles south of the relay station. If the pattern held true, it might also be compromised, and Sarah needed to verify the scope of the enemy's operations. The ride to the second facility took her through different terrain, mostly open ranchland, where concealment would be more difficult. As she approached the location, Sarah could see immediately that this facility had a completely different status. Smoke was rising from the buildings, and she could see the twisted remains of communication towers that had apparently been destroyed by explosives. This facility wasn't captured. It had been completely destroyed. Sarah didn't need to get close to see that the buildings were burned out shells and the equipment was beyond salvage. Whatever had happened here, it had been thorough and devastating. The pattern was becoming clear. Some facilities were being captured and controlled, while others were being completely destroyed. The attackers were making strategic decisions about which locations to preserve and which to eliminate, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of American communication infrastructure. As Sarah turned Thunder toward home, she reflected on what she had learned during this reconnaissance mission. The situation was far worse than Colonel Harrison had indicated. This wasn't just a cyber attack, it was a coordinated military operation involving physical capture of strategic facilities and the taking of American prisoners. The ride back to her farm seemed longer than the journey out, partly because Sarah was eager to report her findings, but also because she was beginning to understand the dangerous new world she was operating in. The peaceful countryside she had known all her life was now a battlefield where enemies moved freely and American forces were being overwhelmed by attacks they couldn't defend against. As Thunder carried her through the gathering dusk, Sarah thought about the captured American soldiers she had seen at the relay station. They were someone's children, someone's husbands and wives, and they were depending on people like her to find them and bring help. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any burden she had ever carried. When she finally saw the lights of her farmhouse in the distance, Sarah realized that her old life of peaceful independence was over, at least for now. She had stepped into a conflict that would test every skill her grandmother had taught her, and every ounce of courage she possessed. But she had also proven something important to herself. While the most advanced military systems in the world were being turned against their operators, a farm girl on horseback could still gather vital intelligence and move freely through enemy-controlled territory. Sometimes the old ways really were the best ways. As she dismounted in her own barnyard, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring even greater challenges. Colonel Harrison would need to act on the information she had gathered, and that action would likely put her in even greater danger. But tonight, she would care for Thunder, secure her farm, and prepare for whatever came next. The modern world might be failing, but Sarah Chen was just getting started. Sarah had barely finished unsaddling Thunder when she heard the familiar sound of helicopters approaching her farm. This time, there were more of them, at least 4 aircraft circling her property before landing in her largest pasture. As she walked toward the landing zone, she could see that Colonel Harrison and his team had returned with additional personnel and equipment, but something was different about their demeanor. The confident military bearing she had observed that morning was gone, replaced by an urgent tension that spoke of desperation. Colonel Harrison approached her quickly, his face grim. "Ms. Chen, thank God you're back safely. We need your report immediately. The situation has deteriorated significantly since you left." "How much worse can it get?" Sarah asked as they walked toward her farmhouse. "We've lost contact with 6 more installations in the past 4 hours, but more importantly, we've detected movement suggesting a coordinated ground assault is beginning. Whatever intelligence you gathered may be our only chance to understand what we're facing." Inside her kitchen, Sarah spread Colonel Harrison's map on the table and began marking locations while describing what she had observed. As she detailed the captured personnel, the destroyed facility, and the organized enemy presence, she watched the faces of the military officers grow increasingly troubled. "You're certain they were holding American soldiers as prisoners?" asked Major Patricia Wells, an intelligence officer who had arrived with the expanded team.
"Absolutely certain."
At least 6 people in U.S. Army uniforms, hands secured behind their backs, under guard by armed civilians. Colonel Harrison studied the marked locations on the map. "This confirms our worst fears. We're not just dealing with a cyber attack. We're facing a hybrid warfare scenario with physical occupation of strategic assets." "What does that mean exactly?" Sarah asked. Major Wells answered. "It means our enemies have found a way to use our technological dependence against us. They've disabled our digital systems while simultaneously capturing or destroying our physical infrastructure. It's the perfect strategy against a modern military force. But here's what I don't understand, Sarah said. Who has the capability to do this? This isn't some random terrorist group. This requires sophisticated planning and significant resources. Colonel Harrison exchanged glances with Major Wells. We have our suspicions, but intelligence is limited when our surveillance systems are compromised. What we do know is that this appears to be a state-level operation, possibly involving multiple adversaries working together. The real problem, Major Wells continued, is that our standard response protocols assume functioning communication and coordination systems. When those systems are compromised, our forces can't coordinate effectively. Individual units are fighting blind, not knowing what's happening beyond their immediate vicinity. Sarah poured coffee for everyone, using her grandmother's old percolator that worked on her wood-burning stove. The simple act of preparing coffee the old-fashioned way seemed to underscore the conversation about technological vulnerability. So what happens now? Sarah asked. We need more intelligence, and we need it fast, Colonel Harrison said. Based on your reconnaissance, we believe there may be a pattern to which facilities are being captured versus destroyed. If we can understand that pattern, we might be able to predict their next moves. You want me to check more locations? We want you to help us with something more complicated, Major Wells said. We've identified what we believe is a command center for the enemy operations in this region. It's housed in an abandoned mining complex about 40 miles north of here. We need someone to get close enough to gather intelligence about their operations and capabilities. Sarah studied the location on the map. She knew the area well. It was remote, mountainous terrain where her grandmother used to take her mushroom hunting. This is much more dangerous than checking on communication facilities. If this is really their command center, they'll have serious security. We know it's dangerous, Colonel Harrison admitted. But, Miss Chen, you've already proven that you can move through hostile territory undetected. Right now, you may be the only person in the region who can gather this kind of intelligence. What about your own special forces? Surely you have people trained for this kind of mission. Major Wells shook her head. Our special forces units are equipped with digital communication gear, GPS navigation, night vision systems, all the technology that's now compromised. They're effectively blind and deaf in the current environment. You, on the other hand, navigate by landmarks and communicate by returning with information. You're immune to their electronic warfare. Sarah walked to her kitchen window and looked out at her peaceful farm. In the distance, she could see thunder grazing contentedly in the pasture, completely unaware of the crisis engulfing the world beyond the farm's borders. If I do this, and if something happens to me, what becomes of my farm, my animals? We'll make sure everything is cared for, Colonel Harrison promised. But Sarah, I need to be honest with you about something else. Our analysis suggests that if we can't stop this operation soon, it may spread nationwide. The attacks are escalating in scope and sophistication. What does that mean for people like me, people living off the grid? Initially, you'd probably be safer than most, Major Wells explained. But if the attackers succeed in completely dismantling our infrastructure, the secondary effects would eventually reach everyone. Supply chains, medical services, food distribution, everything depends on systems that are being targeted. Sarah thought about her neighbors, the Henderson and Morrison families, whose lives had already been disrupted by the technological failures. Even her self-sufficient lifestyle would eventually be affected if the broader social and economic systems collapsed. How long do I have to decide? We need to move tonight, Colonel Harrison said urgently. Our intelligence indicates they're planning to expand their operations tomorrow. If we're going to gather useful information, it has to be now. Sarah made her decision with the same instinctive certainty her grandmother had taught her to trust. I'll do it, but I have conditions. Name them. First, I go. Alone. No backup, no support team, no communication equipment. The moment you add technology to this mission, I become vulnerable to their electronic warfare. Agreed. Second, if I don't return within 24 hours, you assume I've been captured or killed, and you proceed with whatever plans you have without waiting for my intelligence. Understood. Third, when this crisis is over, however it ends, you leave me and my farm alone. I don't want to become a permanent asset of the military. You have my word. Sarah spent the next hour preparing for what might be the most dangerous mission of her life. She packed light, water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a pair of binoculars. She chose her darkest clothing and her most comfortable boots. Most importantly, she spent time with Thunder, explaining what she needed from him. This isn't going to be like our usual trail rides, she told the horse as she saddled him. We're going into dangerous territory, and I need you to be extra careful and quiet.
Thunder seemed to sense the seriousness of the situation.
He stood perfectly still while Sarah checked and rechecked his gear, and when she mounted, he moved with unusual alertness and precision. The ride to the mining complex took her through the most challenging terrain she had ever attempted in darkness. Using only starlight and her intimate knowledge of the landscape, Sarah guided Thunder along narrow mountain trails that hadn't been used for decades. Several times, she had to dismount and lead him around particularly treacherous sections where a misstep could mean a fatal fall. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah began to see signs of unusual activity. Fresh tire tracks on abandoned roads, the distant glow of lights where there should be only wilderness, and most unnervingly, the sound of generators running in areas that had no reason to have power. About 2 miles from the target location, Sarah found a secure place to leave Thunder, a small meadow with water and grass, sheltered by rocks and accessible only through a narrow passage. She spoke quietly to him as she tied his reins. "Stay here, boy. Don't make any noise, no matter what you hear. I'll be back for you." The final approach to the mining complex had to be made on foot, crawling the last quarter mile on her stomach through rocky terrain that provided good concealment but punished every movement. When Sarah finally reached a position where she could observe the target, what she saw exceeded her worst expectations. The abandoned mining complex had been transformed into a major military operation. Dozens of vehicles were parked in organized formations. Temporary buildings had been erected, and communication equipment that dwarfed anything she had seen at the relay station was operating throughout the facility. But what truly shocked Sarah was the scale of personnel involved. This wasn't a small team of saboteurs. There were at least 200 people working in organized shifts throughout the complex. Whatever this operation was, it represented a massive commitment of resources and planning. From her concealed position, Sarah observed the facility for several hours, documenting everything she could see. The operation appeared to have multiple components: a communication center where technicians monitored dozens of computer screens, a logistics area where supplies were being organized and distributed, and what appeared to be a command center where senior personnel coordinated activities. Most disturbing of all, Sarah observed a detention area where dozens of American military personnel were being held as prisoners. These weren't just the few soldiers she had seen at the relay station. This was a systematic capture of American forces on a much larger scale. As dawn approached, Sarah realized she had gathered enough information. The scope of what she had observed was so far beyond anything Colonel Harrison had anticipated that she needed to return immediately with her intelligence. But as she began to withdraw from her observation position, disaster struck. A loose rock, dislodged by her movement, clattered down the slope and came to rest near a guard post. The sound was small, but in the quiet of dawn it was enough to alert a sentry. Sarah pressed herself against the rocks as a guard began moving toward her position, speaking quietly into a radio. She had perhaps 30 seconds before her hiding place would be discovered. Moving as silently as she could, she began crawling away from the approaching guard, using every technique her grandmother had taught her about moving unseen. The next few minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. Guards spread out across the area, searching methodically for the source of the disturbance. Twice, armed men passed within arm's reach of her position. Only her dark clothing and absolute stillness kept her from being discovered. When the guards finally concluded that the sound had been caused by wildlife, Sarah waited another hour before beginning her retreat. The journey back to Thunder seemed to take forever, with every sound magnified and every shadow potentially concealing an enemy. When she finally reached the meadow where she had left her horse, Sarah felt overwhelming relief to find him exactly where she had left him, calm and ready for the journey home. But as she mounted and began the long ride back to her farm, Sarah realized that what she had discovered changed everything. This wasn't just an attack on American infrastructure. It was the beginning of an invasion. The enemy had established a major operational base in American territory, captured significant numbers of American military personnel, and demonstrated the capability to neutralize the most advanced military technology in the world. As Thunder carried her through the pre-dawn darkness toward home, Sarah understood that she was probably carrying the most important intelligence gathered since the crisis began. The question was whether Colonel Harrison and his forces would be able to act on that intelligence before it was too late. The sun was rising as Sarah's farm came into view, and she could see the military helicopters still parked in her pasture. But something was wrong. There were no guards visible, no activity around the aircraft, and an ominous silence hung over the entire scene. As she rode closer, Sarah's heart sank. The base camp that had been bustling with activity when she left was now completely deserted. Equipment had been abandoned, vehicles sat empty, and there was no sign of Colonel Harrison or any of his personnel. Dismounting near her farmhouse, Sarah found a note pinned to her front door. Written in Colonel Harrison's handwriting, it contained just 4 words that confirmed her worst fears: the base has fallen. Sarah Chen, the farm girl who didn't need technology, was now completely alone in a war zone, carrying intelligence that might be America's last hope, but with no one left to give it to.